This is apropos. Well, the US and Colombia appear to have pulled back from the brink of a trade war after the White House said the South American nation had agreed to accept military aircraft carrying deported migrants. President Donald Trump had threatened tariffs and sanctions on Colombia to punish it for earlier refusing to accept flights carrying deportees as part of his sweeping immigration crackdown. Matthew Mary Carashay has the story.
After a tit-for-tat of tariff threats, an escalating row between the United States and Colombia over the repatriation of illegal migrants seems to have abated. On Sunday, Colombian President Gustavo Petro refused to allow 2 military deportation flights to land, accusing the United States of treating migrants like criminals. U.S. President Donald Trump quickly responded, imposing 25% tariffs on all Colombian goods coming into the U.S., a travel ban on Colombian officials, and financial sanctions. Not to be outdone, Petro said he would also impose a 25% tariff on American goods. Nonetheless, just hours later, both sides said the impasse had subsided.
Seguiremos recibiendo a los colombianos.
We will continue to receive Colombians who return as deportees, guaranteeing them dignified conditions as citizens with rights.
Como ciudadanos sujetos de derechos.
On Thursday, Mexico also refused to let a U.S. military aircraft land with migrants. In the past, Trump has threatened Mexico with 25% tariffs to force further action against illegal migrants and fentanyl flowing into the U.S. On Friday, 265 migrants deported from the United States landed in Guatemala. And on Saturday, about 80 others arrived in Brazil in conditions the local government described as degrading.
The complaints from the people who arrived were very serious. We had families, children with autism or with some type of disability who went through very serious situations.
Trump began his second term with a flurry of executive actions aimed at toughening entry into the United States. On his first day in office, he signed orders declaring a national emergency at the southern U.S. border and announced the deployment of more troops to the area.
For more on this story, let's bring in Sergio Guzman, director of political consultancy firm Colombia Risk Analysis. Thank you so much, Sergio, for being with us this evening. Before coming on air, it remained unclear whether the Colombian president has relinquished all of his demands. Bogota saying it has sent its own planes to the US to bring home deportees. So is this row actually over?
Well, maybe it's the first round in a much more prolonged confrontation between Washington and Colombia under President Trump and Gustavo Petro. These are two presidents with very short tempers and two presidents that are ready to face off people that are confronted. Petro, on the one hand, wants to come off as the leader of the South, of the global South, trying to face a North American sort of a more eager and agitated president. And President Trump wants to make Colombia an example of for any other government that crosses him. So it was a match made in heaven, if you will, for the perfect storm to happen in Colombia these days.
And you've pointed out that Petro, he's previously and quite regularly accepted deportation flights. So what specifically was he objecting to this time? Was the fact that these migrants were being put into handcuffs and being chained effectively? Is that specifically what his concerns were here?
We don't think so, because in the past, other deportation flights have happened under the same conditions. The only difference is that when those happened under a Democratic president, Joe Biden, Petro didn't much as bat an eye to what was happening. But now with Donald Trump in office, Petro saw it as an opportunity for confrontation. In fact, Petro at 3 a.m. had tweeted that we should welcome the migrants with open arms and roses at the airport. And then 30 minutes later, he changed his mind and announced mid-flights that the flights were no longer welcome to land on Colombian soil. So yes, this was a huge about-face from Gustavo Petro, one that we Colombians were very used to, but also the response by U.S. President Trump seemed to be a bit disproportionate on our end, mostly to make an example out of Petro, but also to be a show of force to what Trump is willing to do to other countries.
And how critical has Petro been of US policy previously and of former presidents?
Well, Petro has, invoked the global South, the fight against slavery. He very famously broke off relationships with Israel, that is a close ally to the United States. And he's also announced an intention and interest in joining the Chinese Belt and Road initiatives and the BRICS initiative. And so in that sense, it seems that Colombia is posed to diversify its set of alliances, untethering itself from the United States as our main trading partner and as our main military partner. However, that will take months, and the damage has already been done.
Yeah, because what kind of impact is this likely to have more widely on US relations, not just with Colombia, but with some of its neighbours in Latin America?
I think all neighbors in Latin America are going to look at the US as a less than firm ally, looking at the US commitment to their countries in relation to how strong they are on the issues that are of interest to Trump, but not really a diverse relationship that's based on mutual interests and shared values. In that sense, some of the projects involving drug trafficking, the environment, the diversity of our people, culture, will very certainly be put under the radar for Trump to eliminate.
And do you think it might push some of those countries closer towards the likes of China, Russia, India, the EU?
It could potentially, but you also don't see many of these countries stepping out in support of Colombia or of other countries for that matter. Look at Denmark. It's not clear that a lot of countries have also supported Denmark in their claims for fear of retaliation by the United States. And so, although Petro tried to be the first president to resist Donald Trump's efforts, what he's essentially done is the opposite. He's emboldened Donald Trump to use the same tactic over and over again against governments that he views as opponents or governments that he views as less than constructive to implement some of his foreign policy objectives.
Well, bearing in mind that fear of retaliation, how can countries like Colombia better demonstrate their opposition to Donald Trump's policies when it comes to immigration specifically?
Well, we think that working through multilateral and intergovernmental organizations to address this issue is an important way. Obviously, for the United States, dealing on a one-on-one basis, threatening with individual tariffs and things like that is going to be a preferred option. But if countries round together and show strength, then this might essentially bring Donald Trump to the table. The problem is this was what happened during the first Donald Trump administration. Now Donald Trump seems to have a better grasp of how government works, of how multilateral organizations work, and is much more willing to put his thumb down.
And how important is American trade for Colombia? How much does it rely on access to the US market, for example?
Well, the U.S. is Colombia's principal trade partner. Around 26% of our exports go to the United States, accounting for over $13 billion in interannual trade. Moreover, we receive at least $11 billion in remittances from Colombians working in the United States annually. And so cutting that will be a significant blow to Colombia's GDP, one that the country will not be able to fill that vacuum or that gap in the short term.
And Sergio, looking ahead then to the next 4 years, how do you think Donald Trump's presidency is going to impact Colombia? Your consultancy firm, it said that the two leaders hold essentially opposite policy positions on nearly every issue, making it unlikely that they're going to be able to find common ground anywhere. So what can actually be done to try and find some of that common ground or to move various issues forward, like immigration?
Well, the problem that this has created is not only has Colombia become a central issue to Donald Trump's day-to-day in the first week of his administration, but he's always going to hold sort of a personal grudge to Colombia and to Petro for what has happened this week. This is going to make it very difficult for work happening in the bottom rung of the ladder at the ambassadorial level, at the ministerial level, at the interagency, police, intelligence, judicial collaboration. All of these issues are going to be much harder to work in between Colombia and the United States. So all aspects of the relationship are now being put in check. But let's not forget, in the middle of this, there's hundreds of thousands of people involved, hundreds of thousands of migrants, of people who have been displaced, of victims that live in the United States and are now in a very, very uncertain situation about their repatriation and the circumstances that's going to happen. And then after Colombia, there's a reason why those people left Colombia to begin with. It's unclear if many of those people are going to be safe. It's unclear if many of those people are going to have an economic livelihood waiting for them once they are here. So evidently, this will bring about a lot of human sorrow and suffering as well.
And also, Sergio, this comes in the context of mounting guerrilla violence in Colombia, issues there on the border with Venezuela. So how is all of that likely to play into it? You've been critical also of the decision to impose a state of emergency in that region.
Well, that's exactly right. One of the things that we've sustained at Colombia Risk Analysis for a while is that what is going to prevent mass migration to the United States is a more secure, more prosperous Colombia. And the best way to work with to ensure that goal is to strengthen the Colombian government's capacity to collaborate with the Colombian government to be able to do that. Instead, what the United States is doing is essentially pulling the rug up under our feet and making it harder for Colombia to operate effectively, ultimately resulting in more migration going to the United States. But that's a long-term issue. The short-term issue is whether or not Donald Trump won the day or not. And that's unfortunately true.
And speaking of collaboration, you've also said that drug policy could be an area for collaboration between Petro and Trump. Have you seen any indication, though, that this is likely under the Trump administration?
The biggest issue there is Donald Trump wants to make the number of hectares of coca cultivated a central turning point of the relationship. And Petro is trying to move away from that metric and much more closely associate the interdiction, the amount of tons of cocaine that are captured in sea or in transit to the United States. And Colombia's interdiction is growing, but it's undoubtable that Colombia's number of hectares of cocaine has been growing exponentially since Petro took office.
Sergio, we'll have to leave it there for now, but we do really appreciate your time on the programme. Thanks for joining us this evening. That is Sergio Guzman, Director of the political consultancy firm Colombia Risk Analysis. Well, that's it from us.